Question for you. Are you any good at puzzles? Because I've got a real head scratcher for you. 4 people living in a locked apartment go to bed. Only 2 wake up the next morning. The family's teenage daughter is brutally murdered, and the cook is missing, but the 2 left alive say they didn't see or hear anything unusual. The apartment is still locked from the inside, and there's no evidence anyone forced their way in or out. So, what happened? Or in this case, the question is, who killed Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade? Hey there, I'm Amy, and you're watching True Crime Recaps. Our story starts in an upper middle-class neighborhood in Noida, India on May 16th, 2008. At 6 o'clock on that Friday morning, the Talwar's maid tried to push open the outer gate like she always did, but it wouldn't budge. So she rang the bell. Now, normally, Hemraj, the family's live-in cook, would let her in, but the door stayed closed. Inside, at the same time, the lady of the house, Nupur Talwar, was making a call to Hemraj's phone. It connected, but it quickly hung up. And when she called right back, the phone was off. Outside, the maid was still ringing the bell. She pressed it maybe 3 times before Nupur appeared at the metal mesh door on the other side of the gate. She couldn't come any closer because that door was latched from the outside. Just seeing her face that early in the morning was very strange. The maid had only been working there for a week, but she already knew that Nupur and her husband, Rajesh, were late risers. But on that morning, there she was, awake and at the door. So Nupur asked if she knew where Hemraj went, and she didn't. Nupur wondered out loud if he'd gone to the store to pick up some milk. But in any case, the maid had to get in, but she explained that the gate wouldn't open. It was locked. So Nupur went back inside to grab a set of keys, and the maid was left waiting outside for at least 2 or 3 minutes. Now, when Nupur appeared at the balcony, she told her to try the gate again. Maybe it was just stuck. But by this time, the maid is sick and tired of walking up and down the stairs to the stupid gate, and she just wants to get inside and get her day started, so she asked her to throw down the keys just in case. So Nupur throws them down. Now, to get up to the Talwar's place, she had to get through the outer gate. She pushed again, and this time it opened without the keys. Then she had to get through the metal mesh door. That one was latched shut from the outside, just latch. A wooden front door served as the final entrance. It locked automatically when it was closed. So inside the apartment, while the maid is outside navigating the stairs and these 3 doors, Rajesh wandered into the dining room. And on the table, he sees an empty bottle of Ballantine Scotch whiskey, and a bloody palm print is smeared across it. When the maid stepped inside a minute later, everything had changed. Nupur met her at the door, crying. She's saying something about Hemraj. She asked what happened, and Nupur pulled her into their daughter's bedroom. So 13-year-old Aarushi was lying in a pool of blood. Her head was beaten and her throat slit. The walls were spattered with blood. So were the floor, the front of her door, but the white flannel blanket that covered her body was clean. And so was the school bag that had been laid on her face and the stuffed animals and pink pillow next to her. The Talwars pointed at the gruesome scene, saying, "Look what Hemraj has done." Now, almost 8 million Nepalese citizens work and live in India. Hemraj was one of them. He'd been with the Talwars for a few months shy of a year. He was 45, good at his job, pleasant to be around, and when he was working, he stayed in the background and he kept to himself. His own family, a wife, kids, and a grandson, lived in a little village over the border in Nepal, a few hours away. He sent them money as often as he could. And now he was missing. His room was undisturbed, and his dinner from the night before was still on the counter, uneaten. Aarushi was days away from her 14th birthday on May 24th. She was looking forward to hosting a big party. She'd gotten permission to invite all of her friends, and there were plenty to choose from since she was a shy but popular student at the Delhi public school. Now, this was the kind of girl that teachers, parents, and her classmates all loved. She was such a good student, she'd even told her father that she planned on qualifying for a scholarship to university so he didn't have to save any money for her college. How adorable is that? But sadly, that day would never come. 15 minutes after her body had been discovered, what with all of the commotion, the neighbors were at the apartment. And meanwhile, the maid ran over to Nupur's parents' house nearby to tell them to come quick, and they in turn rallied their friends and family to the Talwars. Around 6:30 a.m., one neighbor popped back over to his own place to alert the complex's security guard and asked them to call the police. Now, every apartment in the gated community had the same basic floor plan. 1,300 square feet with 3 bedrooms and bathrooms, a living room, kitchen, dining room, and a short flight of stairs up to an open-air terrace. Now, one of the bedrooms, in this case, the room used by Hemraj, had a separate entrance. Now, let's talk about doors for a moment. Because, in a locked door mystery like this one, the doors take on a special significance. The one door in Hemraj's room opened onto the corridor. A second door led from his room into the apartment. Aarushi's bedroom door is worth mentioning too. Just like the front door, it automatically locked when closed. She could turn the handle to open it from the inside, like she wasn't locked in, but from the outside, you'd need a key to get in, and the key was always kept on Nooper's nightstand. So, how did Aarushi's killer get into her room? That's the question, isn't it? Whoever opened her door that night left the key behind a sculpture in the living room. But what if her door was never locked? Nooper can't remember if she left the key on her nightstand like she always did, or if she accidentally left it in Aarushi's lock that night. Now, this was just one of the many questions that baffled investigators. The first officers were there by 7 a.m. By that time, more than a dozen grieving visitors were wandering around the crime scene, and a pack of journalists wasn't far behind. So Rajesh and Nooper were both successful dentists. They met in dental school. He was Punjabi, she was not. Now, back in the 80s when they got together, it was still rare for people from different communities to marry, but they'd both been raised with modern values and their families were happy to welcome the new couple. Aarushi was their much-loved only child. When she was born, they moved from Delhi to nearby Noida so Nooper's parents could help with the baby while they, focused on their careers. By 2008, Rajesh and Nooper were at the top of their game. They had 2 clinics, one in Delhi and a second local clinic that they ran with another couple, Anita and Praful Durrani, a dentist and a doctor. And they also had a daughter around Arushi's age, and the 2 families were very close friends. The Talwars were the last sort of family anyone would expect to be part of a murder investigation. But how exactly they were involved? Now, that was a question that was getting harder to answer. Though getting fingerprints at the scene was proving to be almost impossible, considering how many people were there. But the police tried to lift what they could, and they took pictures of every room, and it was quickly determined that nothing seemed to have been stolen. One of the guests pointed out what looked like blood on the door to the roof terrace, but it was locked, and no one could pinpoint where the key was, and the police didn't seem too upset about it. They took a look at the blood and decided that it looked more like rust than a bodily fluid. Now, the bloody whiskey bottle, on the other hand, everyone agreed that that was something strange and way out of place. And what was even stranger about that was the fact that the liquor cabinet was hidden behind a wooden panel. It wasn't easy to spot unless you knew it was there. And they would find out later that the blood on that bottle came from both Aarushi and the missing Hemraj. So who was drinking at the table that night? And where was the cook? So the Talwars were pushing the police to go and find him. Their daughter had been murdered and he had disappeared in the night. So they made it clear they thought that the police were wasting their time in their apartment when the killer was probably on his way across the border to his family in Nepal. So a massive manhunt was launched and a reward was offered for his capture. Any friends and family he had in town were aggressively questioned, including another Nepali man, Krishna, the Talwars' assistant at their clinic. When they brought him in for questioning, he admitted he was friendly with Hemraj, but he hadn't seen him in a couple of days. Although he did have a juicy tidbit to offer. He claimed Rajesh was having an affair with his dental partner, Anita Durrani. Meanwhile, Arushi's body was on its way to an autopsy. The exam was quick. Her cause of death was the beating she took to the head. Her heart had already stopped by the time her throat was slit. So why would someone do something so horrible to this girl if she was already technically dead? They couldn't determine what exactly she was hit with, but it had left like a V-shaped mark on her forehead. And her throat had been slit with some type of sharp, long knife that had cut her throat with surgical precision. rape wasn't mentioned. No semen or anything abnormal in that area was reported. When the medical examiner was finished, they brought her body back to the Talwars and laid it on blocks of ice for mourners to say goodbye before she was cremated later that same day. Same day. Now, this may seem like it's happening fast, and it totally was, but there is a reason for that. It's a Hindu custom to cremate the body within 24 hours after death. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, just 10 hours after her body was found, the Talwar's driver knocked on the neighbor's door. The key to their own roof was still missing, so he wanted to put that leftover ice on their roof and keep Aarushi's bloody mattress there too, so the maids could clean up. Now, by the next morning, May 17th, the story about this gruesome killing was making headlines, but the crime scene was still unsealed. And when I say unsealed, I mean, journalists were wandering through the apartment, interviewing anyone who would speak to them, just picking things up, looking at them, putting them down, just unsealed. Meanwhile, Rajesh and Nupur were on their way to spread their daughter's ashes in the Holy River. But back at the house, a retired police officer, a friend of Rajesh's brother, Dinesh, he stopped by to offer his condolences. While he was there, he kind of goes into police officer mode, and he noticed blood stains on the stairs and what looked like that blood on the terrace door handle. Now, the blood on the stairs he chalked up to Arushi's mattress being dragged outside and over to the neighbor's roof, but the stains on the door handle couldn't be explained as easily. Dinesh explained that the key was still missing, but they wanted that door open. Eventually, one of the on-duty police officers broke the lock, and when they stepped out onto the terrace, they found out what happened to that missing cook. Hemraj's bloody body was lying in the far corner of the roof near the air conditioning unit. Judging from the trail of blood across the terrace, someone had dragged him there. The grate from the AC was on top of him, and a bedsheet was hanging over the divider that separated the Talwar's terrace from their neighbors. A bloody handprint was on the wall next to him, and a bloody shoe print was nearby. His body was so decomposed, no one recognized him. Eventually, Rajesh was able to identify him based on the shirt and bracelet he was wearing. And later they learned he'd been killed in the same exact way as their daughter, beaten with the same object, and his throat was slit with the same weapon in the same precise way. And now they were dealing with a double murder. Their conclusion? Both victims were killed between midnight and 1 a.m. So, where was everyone the night before? Rajesh and Nupur were at work all day. Aarushi was at school. Hemraj followed his usual routine, shopping and cooking the family's dinner. At 8 p.m., he got a call from a payphone less than a mile away. Who was it? Who knows? That caller has never been identified. And Hemraj's phone disappeared after his murder, and it's never been found. But they did learn that when Nupur called it that morning, it was pinging off a cell tower in that same area. So the phone was somewhere nearby their apartment complex. By 9:30, the family sat down to dinner together. This was confirmed by their driver, who popped over to give his boss the car keys before he clocked out for the night. And while they ate, Nupur and Rajesh gave Aarushi a new digital camera as an early birthday present. And, they all played around with it for a while. The last smiling, happy photo of her was snapped at around 10:10 p.m. After that, they all retired to their rooms. At 11, Rajesh asked Nupur to go into Arushi's room and switch on the internet router. It sat next to the wall across from her door. Now, it's not totally clear why it wasn't already on, but when Nupur went in, using her key to open the door, she saw Aarushi reading in bed. Now, that's when she may or may not have left that key in the lock. She can't remember. She went back to bed. Rajesh was online checking on some investments, and he called a dentist associate in Chicago and sent a few emails. The last one went out just before midnight. Meanwhile, Nupur's asleep. Typically, Aarushi would have been texting and chatting until at least 1 a.m., but on that night, her phone went dead at 9:10, was never used again. It also went missing after the murders, and a stranger found it in the gutter not far away months later. The SIM card was missing, and all the data, images, everything was gone. It had been wiped clean. What was on that someone didn't want anyone to see? But, I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to that night. So when Arushi's friend couldn't get a hold of her on her phone, he called the family's landline around midnight, but no one picked up. And a text he sent around 12:30 was never read. Again, their time of death was most likely between midnight and 1 a.m., but the security guards didn't see anyone come or go into the apartment at all. Then at 3:45 a.m., after Aarushi and Hemraj were probably already gone, the internet router was turned off in her room. Now, did her killer do that? Or did someone walk by her bloody body without even knowing it? And how would that even be possible? Her bedroom was right next to her parents' room. And they didn't say that they went in there at 3:45. So could two people be brutally murdered without them hearing a sound because both doors were closed and the air conditioning was blowing? But were both doors closed? Reports say Aarushi's blood splattered on the front of her door. If that's true, then her door would have been wide open. And it was definitely open in the morning because if you remember, the key was only later found in the living room. But who left it there? Why would someone kill a 13-year-old girl and the family's cook? Those were the questions police were frantically trying to answer. And since they'd spent the first hours chasing the wrong suspect, they were way behind. But they were beginning to suspect that they hadn't been completely wrong. The murders were an inside job. On May 23rd, Rajesh was arrested. The first working theory was a toss-up between two ideas. The first was that he heard a noise and discovered Hemraj in Arushi's bed. He took his life in a fury and then slit her throat as an honor killing to save her from the shame of rape. So if you're not familiar with the term honor killing, because I don't know, Chris wasn't, so I don't assume. It's a horrifying custom that happens mainly in Pakistan. It's like when a woman in the family is raped, then a male in the family kills her to preserve her honor and the family's dignity. It's horrible. And thankfully pretty rare. But it happens. It can happen anywhere. But did it happen here? That's the question. So with their daughter dead, they believed the family hid the cook's body on the roof so that they could send them on a wild goose chase while they disposed of his body. The idea being that he would be the main suspect that was never found and the case would start and stop there. Now, as for the bloody whiskey bottle, that was easily explained. After a long night killing and hiding bodies, Rajesh had a drink and left it on the table. Now, the second theory was mostly the same, but with a few tweaks. In this theory, they claimed Rajesh was having an affair with his partner, Anita Durrani, and Aarushi found out about it and confided in Hemraj. The cook may or may not have been trying to blackmail Rajesh, so they both had to die, and the cover-up continued from there. The Talwars were outraged. They demanded the case be taken over by the Central Bureau of Investigation, the CBI, and the family had the money and the pull to make that happen. So on June 1st, they took the case over. Now that the big dogs were on board, it was only a matter of time before the truth was revealed. But not quite. The CBI was at a total loss. The crime scene might as well have been a county fair. There were so many people wandering around. And almost all the forensic evidence was destroyed. And all the fingerprints that the police managed to lift, including those bloody prints on that whiskey bottle, were so smudged they were totally useless. But they did agree with the local cops on one thing. It was an inside job. There were no signs of forced entry and the gate was locked from the outside, so whoever did it had access to the house. But they didn't think it was Rajesh. They suspected Hemraj. What? Let me explain. So remember Hemraj and Krishna were friends? Well, 2 days before the crime, Rajesh scolded Krishna for making an implant wrong. It got pretty heated. By the time it was over, Krishna was burning with anger and embarrassment. Rajesh's driver overheard him complaining about it to Hemraj in Nepali, and when he asked him what the problem was, he claimed that Krishna said something about getting even with the doctor. And when the CBI questioned him about it, he stuck to the same story he'd given the police originally. He said he hadn't seen Hemraj, but he speculated that maybe he'd found out about the doctor's affair and paid for it with his life. Now, they checked him over. He had no defensive wounds on him, and they didn't find any bloody clothes. But they did discover a blood-stained kukri knife. A kukri is a long, curved machete-type blade. It's a very common household item for Nepalese families and has been for centuries. In my family, it'd be like finding a wine opener. Also, to be clear that they don't know for sure that a kukri was used to slit their throats. There was no murder weapon found, but they're just making a guess based on this theory. But here's the thing. The blood on the knife they found wasn't human, and the blade was so blunt it couldn't have been the murder weapon. But they also noticed that his pillowcase had a spot of blood on it. Now, this plays a big part in this case, sort of, but we're not quite there yet. So just keep that in the back of your mind for now. In India, back in 2008, the law had 3 tools on their side to get to the truth. A polygraph, that's common, a narco test, which is basically truth serum under hypnosis, and brain mapping, which uses electrodes to monitor your brain activity while you're asked pointed questions like, did you kill those 2 people? Now, none of these tests are admissible in court. They're meant to help generate leads, but, they're not a substitute for hard evidence. So, with that in mind, when Krishna took his narco test, the CBI says he confessed while he was under. And here's what they said he said. On the night of May 15th, after the family went to bed, he was at the Talwar house, hanging out with Hemraj and 2 other men, Raj Kumar and Vijay. Now, Raj Kumar worked for the Duranis, the Talwar's business partners, and Vijay worked for the family next door to the Talwars. They all had some drinks and watched a Nepalese TV show in his room, and the conversation got around to Aarushi. At some point, Krishna and Raj Kumar snuck up to her room and she was murdered. Hemraj was killed on the terrace to stop him from turning them in. When they arrested the 2 other men, Raj Kumar and Vijay, the CBI claimed that they both told basically the same story in their narco tests, but added a few details about assaulting the girl and which one actually killed them. So by mid-July 2008, the 3 of them were in jail and Rajesh was released. But just when you think that the case was cracked, hold on, because there's another twist coming. Krishna emphatically denied everything. He claimed the CBI investigator was trying to get him to take the blame, even going so far as to torture him during the narco test. But none of it was true. In fact, he said he was asleep at home when it happened, and his sister and brother-in-law backed that up. They say he was home, in bed, by 10, and never left. He was up and at 'em by 6 the next morning, and not one of them saw him with any blood on his person at any time. I mean, of course, they're related to him too, so, take it with a grain of salt, but they were adamant he didn't do it. As for the other 2 men he had allegedly mentioned, well, they both had alibis too, pretty good ones. Raj Kumar was with the Duranis until after midnight, and he couldn't have gotten to the Talwars on his bike before 1 a.m. when both victims were supposedly killed. And Vijay was also seen by his employers late that night. So with no other evidence to back up the servants did it theory, they had to let all 3 of them go. But the CBI wasn't about to give up just yet. Instead, they scrapped the results of their first investigation and started over in the fall of 2009. And the new team of investigators thought the parents did it. Here's their reasoning. The apartment wasn't huge. It's only about 1,300 square feet, which led them to one simple question. The question you've probably been asking too. How could 2 people be murdered without anyone hearing a thing? And not just murdered, we're talking beaten over the head with your throat slit. So the first CBI team did some sound tests in 2008 to find out how much they could hear with the doors closed and the AC on, and they agreed with the Talwars. They couldn't hear much, but the second team disagreed. They also didn't buy the story that Hemraj had people over. To them, it seemed ludicrous. It would have been beyond bizarre for a live-in staff to do that, and he needed that job. And beyond the cultural norms of it, there was no evidence that anyone else was there. The police took pictures of the rooms, and this team thought that his looked like it always did, with no signs of a party. Except, here's the thing. So, remember that retired police officer who finally convinced someone to break the lock on the terrace door? Well, he swore that he saw empty bottles and impressions on Hemraj's mattress that pointed to some kind of gathering. Then there was the fact that Aarushi's room had been what they're calling dressed up after she was killed. That white blanket on her body, the toys and pillow on her bed, the school bag covering her face. What kind of killer would take the time to do that and then sit down and have a drink at the dining room table? And keep in mind, that liquor cabinet was hidden behind a panel. You would have to know it was there to open it. But there was one thing that they couldn't rationalize. Why? Why were they killed? There didn't seem to be much to prove that Rajesh was having an affair, like Krishna had claimed. And Rajesh and Anita denied it, of course, so they couldn't really run too far with that theory. But they did learn that Hemraj had been trying to find another job in the weeks before he died. And he had told his wife back in Nepal that Rajesh had a bad temper. And he'd allegedly threatened him about not talking to anyone about anything he saw or heard in their house. But what could he possibly have heard or seen that would make his boss kill him and his daughter? The CBI couldn't figure it out, and they didn't have any evidence to prove anything. So, at the end of 2010, they filed a report recommending that the case be closed because there was no evidence to point to anyone. But 2 months later, the court decided that it warranted a trial. So Rajesh and Nupur were arrested. By 2013, a judge was listening to both sides of the case. The CBI's theory was this. On the night of the murders, Rajesh heard a noise and went to Hemraj's room to check it out. Then he picked up one of his golf clubs and checked on his daughter. That's when he saw them in some sort of compromising position and freaked out. He hit the cook over the head once, but when he went to hit him again, he moved and he accidentally hit Aarushi. By that time, Nupur was awake and the two of them came up with a plan to cover up what happened. They slit both victims' throats with a surgical knife, which they would have had access to in their practice, and hid Hemraj on the roof, cleaned up Aarushi so no one would know that she'd been assaulted, and then they sat down and drank some whiskey, assuming the police wouldn't ask questions when they told them that their cook did it. That was a theory, but it also had some holes. Mainly, it was the why of it no one could understand. Their narco tests revealed some typical family power struggles, but nothing necessarily sinister. And none of Hemraj's DNA was even found in Aarushi's room. So, forensically speaking, he was never there, which meant there was nothing to support the honor-killing theory or the idea that Rajesh had found him in his daughter's room and jumped to conclusions. And furthermore, they couldn't say for sure that Aarushi was killed in her bed either, since the crime scene was literally cleaned up so quickly. Even the mattress was removed and hosed down. And the police only took a sample from it that morning. They did document something strange, though. Something that sort of supported the theory that she'd been cleaned up to cover up any evidence of an assault. But who did it and why? Who knows? The sheet under her bottom area was wet, but her pajama pants were dry. Like she'd been washed and her pants pulled up after the fact. In his first report, the medical examiner didn't mention sexual assault, but at trial, he testified that she looked like she could have been penetrated and then cleaned up. Unfortunately, like everything else in this case, they didn't have any evidence to prove it. And the samples he took of some whitish fluid found inside her somehow got mixed up with someone else's, so it was useless. The CBI also claimed they had some unusual phone activity to support their theory about an elaborate cover-up. And this is how they explained why the first medical report didn't mention any signs of assault. Now, see what you make of this. Phone records showed that between 3 and 6 p.m. on May 16th, some kind of weird phone tree was activated. Now follow me here. While Aarushi was being autopsied, Rajesh's older brother, Dinesh, called his family friend, a local eye doctor. That doctor called the retired police officer that found Hemraj, and he called an unknown number. And then it would go back down the chain, the unknown number to the officer, to the doctor, to Dinesh, over and over 6 times. And then that happened again a couple of times the next morning. The family couldn't really explain it, but they denied that it was somehow nefarious. But the CBI claimed it was proof of them trying to alter the results of the autopsy, like colluding. But why? Why would they go to so much trouble to cover up a crime, but leave one of the victims on their roof and a bloody whiskey bottle on the table? Their defense argued that the CBI had it right the first time when they said that the servants did it. Now, let's talk about that pillow they found at Krishna's house. When it was logged into evidence in 2008, the DNA on it was traced back to Hemraj, but no one seemed to notice or care until the Talwar's defense team called it out. If it was just, it's complicated. Follow me. If it was really from Hemraj, then it meant Krishna could have killed him, or at least, been there, and gotten some of his blood and DNA on his hair, and then transferred it to his pillow. But the CBI shut that down. For one thing, their first reaction was that there would have been a ton more than just a spot of blood, if that was true. And then they claimed that the pillowcase actually belonged to Hemraj. So, of course, his DNA was on it, but it was just mislabeled. But it was actually pulled from his room, not Krishna's. So, that's weird. Or, maybe it's not. Maybe it was mislabeled. After all, nothing in this case was done by the book. And then there's that internet router. So the CBI claimed her parents turned it off after she was murdered. But why? Why would they do that? Why would anyone do that? Maybe they didn't. No one could explain why it happened, but the next day, the router was turning itself off and on again, even though no one was using the internet. So bottom line, if 4 people are alone in an apartment and 2 of them are murdered, it's up to the 2 left alive to explain it. And the Talwars couldn't, or wouldn't, depending on what you believe. In November 2013, they were sentenced to life in prison, but this story doesn't end there. Since all the evidence against them was circumstantial, they appealed. And in 2017, they were acquitted and set free. And since then, they moved out of Noida, and Rajesh has been trying to reestablish his dental practice, while Nupur has gotten involved in some charity work. And Aarushi and Hemraj's murders are still unsolved. So, what do you think happened? Let's talk about it down below, but don't go away. There's more crime in Half the Time is coming up right now in this next recap. And remember to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, take care.